Hello and welcome to episode 5 of Reef Tank Basics. Now, choosing your very first coral is an extremely exciting time, but there are a few things you need to know, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, Reef Tank Basics is a real-world hobbyist to hobbyist guide on everything you need to know about running a saltwater aquarium. So if it's your first time here, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss out on anything. Right, let's get stuck in. One of the most commonly asked questions for beginners is, when can I add my first coral? Well, patience is the name of the game here because nothing good happens quickly in a reef tank. New tanks go through all sorts of changes with various blooms and outbreaks that tend to burn themselves off over time. And while that's perfectly normal, corals crave stability, so it's best to wait for at least 2 to 3 months before you even think of adding your first coral. And nobody has ever regretted letting their tank settle for too long. Conversely, if you shoot your bolt too soon, you will probably end up watching your shiny new coral fade and die. A good sign of when your tank is ready is when coralline algae starts to grow, as coralline requires similar conditions to corals in order to grow. But a better sign is when your key parameters are nice and stable. The main levels to get steady are salinity and temperature, easy enough, nitrate and phosphate, a little more tricky, and alkalinity, calcium and magnesium, easy-ish if you stick to a regular weekly water change schedule. So test those parameters every week and wait until they're more or less steady, then you are ready to rock. So what coral should you choose then? There are some great beginner corals out there, and there is an excellent top 7 list right here on YouTube from the most handsome man in reef keeping. Hardiness is probably the name of the game, which means things like leather corals and green star polyps are probably the way to go, as they are pretty much bomb-proof. Zoas are another excellent choice, although they are less indestructible and can wither and die for no apparent reason, and the same can be said of pulsing xenia. But both Zoas and xenia are just so spectacular that they're worth the increase in risk in my book. And they glow brilliantly under blue LEDs, which for me is one of the most magical parts of this glorious hobby. Pretty much all beginner-friendly corals will spread very quickly, so try to place them somewhere they can't spread too far. On their own island is ideal, or at least on a rock that isn't directly joined to most of your other rock work. Buying online is fine, but it is much better to buy in a shop, so you can see it with your own eyes and bother the shopkeeper with all your noob questions. You absolutely want to avoid SPS corals at all costs, as they require strong light and flow and are far less forgiving of imperfect water conditions. They'll also drain your tank of elements like alkalinity and calcium very quickly, which will crash your tank in no time. In my opinion, most LPS corals should also be avoided because they will also deplete elements from your water that will need to be replaced. And that side of things is better safe for when you've mastered the basics and you're ready to level up. But if you really must have LPS, there are some decent beginner-friendly options that will probably be fine in a tank with a solid water change regime. For me, scalemias are the pick of the bunch and are about as pretty a coral as you'll come by, regardless of difficulty. You should also avoid anemones, which are notorious for failing in tanks under 6 months to a year old. Your clownfish don't need an anemone and will make themselves at home in various other corals in your tank, or even more commonly, just in the top corner of your tank by your outlet nozzle, for reasons science has yet to explain. Rockflower anemones are a decent choice if you insist on having an anemone of some kind, as they are much hardier than your usual bubble tip nems, and they're also exceptionally pretty, which is ultimately why we're all here. Whatever coral you buy, you absolutely must dip it in some kind of treatment before it goes in your tank. Corals often have dangerous pests on them, regardless of whether you've bought them from a fellow hobbyist or a reputable retailer. Dipping is really easy and should be part of your standard acclimation procedure. Firstly, rest the bag in your tank for half an hour or so to equalise the temperature. Then pour the water into your dipping vessel and follow the instructions for whatever treatment you choose, which is usually to stir the water occasionally and let your coral sit in the dip for 5 to 10 minutes. Then remove the coral and place it in a low light area of your tank. The low light part is important, as corals will bleach and die if the light is too strong, but they will be right as rain in gentle low light, at least for the short to medium term anyway. I personally don't ever drip acclimate fish or corals, as I don't think it's necessary. But if it makes you more comfortable, drip acclimating corals won't do any harm. Now, you don't need to worry about adding anything special to your tank for your first corals, so resist buying any bottles of potions your local fish shop tries to sell you. Adding coral food will just pollute your tank and feed things like algae and aptasia instead, and corals are like cake moss in that they can go for years between meals. Only instead of looking like death warmed up, sorry Kate, they will be absolutely fine, as they can eat all that delicious light you've spent so much money on. Dosing things like calcium and alkalinity also isn't necessary at first if you're carrying out weekly water changes. Just keep an eye on your levels and think about supplementing them if they start to fall off too much. And again, save all that stuff for when you've mastered the basics. Walk before you can run and all that jazz. Once you've added your first coral, just keep up weekly water changes and regular testing, and ask on a forum like Ultimate Reef or a Facebook group like Worldwide Reefing if you run into any problems. So that just about does it for episode 5 of Reef Tank Basics. Next week in episode 6 we're going to be discussing filtration and algae control, so make sure you stick around for that. And if you enjoyed the video, give me a thumbs up and subscribe for next week, and until next time, happy reefing.